Recipes for Grief, heartfelt storytelling for feely foodies. I'm your host, Andrea Sexton Dumas. Thank you for joining me on the very first episode of Recipes for Grief. I'm Andrea. You are welcome to call me Andrea, Drea, or Dre. My pronouns are she, her. I'd like to take this first episode to really introduce you to me, as well as this podcast. Why me? Why this podcast? And why now? It's a long story, so you may want to grab yourself a cup of tea or a glass of wine, whatever works, and settle in. I am the youngest grandchild of Joseph Darbon and Alberta, you can call her Mother Dumas, who hail from Opelousas in St. Landry County, Louisiana. And I am the grandchild of Ray and Dorothy, who come from Story County and Buchanan County, Iowa. I am the only child of Mitch from Beaumont, Texas, and Beverly from Long Beach, California. Some of my very first memories of life were in the kitchen, cooking with my grandmother. My father would be in the hospital. My mother would be with him. And so my grandmother and I would bake. I can see her before me rolling out pie dough, tearing bread to make bread pudding, using box cake mix for Sunday supper, because you have to have cake with supper, obviously. And even before I get into the details of my grandmother's kitchen, my childhood, I can't talk about food without talking about the land. I am from West Oakland, California, a neighborhood that is now gentrified. When I was growing up, it was a Black neighborhood. My grandmother migrated from the South to West Oakland in the 50s, fleeing racial terror. West Oakland was a neighborhood that Black people could live in. There was a lot of redlining in Oakland, and so my uncle bought my grandmother a house near the naval base. And while I could certainly tell you about her perfect lawn lined with her beloved rose bushes, one of the memories that stays with me the most when I think about my childhood garden is the soil. My grandmother had a small garden to the side of the house where she would grow rhubarb and collard greens, potatoes. I'm sure there were other things, but those are the big three that I remember. But what I remember even more is when I would reach my hand into the soil to grab the potatoes. You feel around to find where the potatoes are. The soil was like silk. It was so soft. And my grandmother would always speak about how nutritious her soil was. It was many years later that I learned about the shell mounds of the Bay Area. I am from and live on Ohlone land. The Ohlone people were the original stewards of this land. They are still here. When you come in through the Pacific Ocean, through the Golden Gate Bridge, you come into what we call the Bay. And lining the Bay historically were huge shell mounds. These shell mounds were where the Ohlone people would gather. They would have sacred rituals. They would eat oysters and leave the shells for their ancestors because it was also a burial ground. And so this gorgeous, silky soil that my grandmother appreciated so very much is also the burial ground. As I reflect on this, I'd actually just like to take a moment and light a candle in honor of the original stewards of this land. And I invite you, if you have a candle nearby, to go ahead and light it with me. And let's just take a moment to honor the native land that we live on. Several years ago, my husband and I went to the Oakland Museum. They had a History of California exhibit. The land here in California is really important to our family. Our lives in Louisiana and Texas were not easy at all. I come from sharecroppers. I come from people who had been kidnapped and enslaved. My family had to flee Louisiana. My family had to flee Texas. And so coming to Oakland, like so many Southerners, coming to the West, it was a place of refuge. My grandmother found safety here where there was none in the South. She rebuilt a community around her church. She rebuilt a vegetable garden. And so when I think about Oakland, West Oakland specifically, when I think about the land there, I can really feel how much my grandmother appreciated being here. I'm very proud to be from West Oakland, even though it's a place that a lot of people have shat on over the years. When I started learning more about the indigenous people who lived here before settlers took over, I could really imagine the hurt that my grandmother might feel, knowing that something so precious to her, something that provided safety and security, was also a place of genocide and harm to Native people. Our family is Catholic. When the Spanish took over California, they built missions up and down all of California. You learn about them in 4th grade. If you're from California, if you grew up here, you probably had to build one. Those Christian sites are sites of genocide and slavery. People indigenous to this land that we call California were enslaved, as my ancestors had been enslaved. So it is not lost on me the paradox that this land holds so much harm while also holding so much safety for so many migrants who had to flee the South. So when my husband and I were walking through this exhibit at the Oakland Museum about the history of California, I imagined myself holding my grandmother's hand and telling her, sharing with her what the people had been through before settlers, before migrants, in the 17 and 1800s, what was here before us. I imagined my grandmother asking for permission to come here. She would likely make an offering, like baking a cake. I could imagine my grandmother, in my own bones, saying, "It's not safe where I live. Can I come here for refuge?" And in a different time and place, if the Ohlone people had not been removed, enslaved, murdered, I can imagine them receiving a middle-aged Black woman with a cake, asking for refuge, and then saying, "Thank you for your offering." I don't know if my grandmother knew the history of indigenous people. As I and as we decolonize our souls, decolonize our kitchens, decolonize our minds, it has become incredibly important for me to expand my capacity to hold all of it. The gratitude that I feel for being in a place that has created stability for my family is also the place that was incredibly violent and unstable for the indigenous people who stewarded this land for at least 10,000 years. There are streets named Shell Mound here. There's a shopping mall on Shell Mound Street. So when I think about my grandmother's silky soil, when I think about the clay soil where I live today, when I think about the shopping center on Shellmound Street, it's become incredibly important for me to make space to honor what was here before first contact, to hold space for what happened after contact. It's become important for me to speak to the land, to honor indigenous traditions in a non-extractive way. It's become important for me to build a relationship with the spirit of this place. And no, I haven't baked a cake for the Ohlone people. And on second thought, my grandmother would have brought gumbo, not a cake. That would have been her sister, my Aunt Frances. But acknowledging all that I'm speaking on right now and learning more about the Ohlone people has encouraged me to pay shumi, land tax, and to listen to the people, really listen, to get still and attune to the Ohlone people whose land I live on and indigenous people worldwide, to investigate and invest in having a real relationship with the land, the people, and the beings all around. For most of my childhood, my parents and I lived with my grandmother, so I spent quite a bit of time with her in the kitchen and in the yard. I was baking by myself probably by the age of 7 or 8, and later I put myself through grad school working as a private cook. Over the years, I've hosted friends and family for brunches, birthdays, and dinner parties. I definitely know my way around the kitchen, and cooking for and nurturing other people is absolutely one of my love languages. But what really led me to this podcast, this moment of honoring recipes for grief, is an experience that I really have only talked about in my intimate relationships. Like so many women, my body and my fertility are very private. We can feel the judgment of what we do with our bodies, and so I don't share this lightly. And I ask for grace as you listen to a personal experience that has really brought me to this moment. It's a much longer story that maybe I'll share someday later, but I'll start in the middle of COVID, because COVID has changed us all. During the 2020 lockdown, my husband and I started trying to get pregnant with medical assistance. We could not afford IVF, and so we went with a less invasive and less expensive route, IUI, intrauteral insemination. Our fertility journey was layered on top of the racial uprisings of 2020 here in the so-called US, alongside the pandemic. And our fertility journey was unsuccessful. I have endometriosis, and the hormones that I had been taking to stimulate my ovaries were causing me to grow cysts, which I had already had growing. We were advised to stop our fertility journey. It was an incredibly griefful time for me personally, my husband, and collectively. Again, we're going through so much. And I have this dirty little secret that I didn't really share with many people at the time, that I was not able to get pregnant. And I found myself craving one of the most delicious things I have ever eaten in my life: Gran's rolls. Gran is not my grandmother. Gran is my aunt's mother-in-law. Stay with me. I have a large family. And like many large Black families, the holidays are everything. It's a family reunion. My grandmother would invite her daughter's mother-in-law, Mrs. Coates, aka Gran, and she would insist that Gran bring her rolls. I can remember them being buttery but not greasy, light and fluffy. Just thinking about them right now, I could smell them. I could see them. And so at the end of this fertility journey, my heart completely broken open. A pandemic raging internationally, and the voices of the Black community finally being listened to in a different way. I became obsessed with these roles. I think ultimately I was looking for comfort in food, and I know I'm not alone in that. The craving for Gran's roles ignited a search that has led me here today, really. I reached out to several of my aunts asking if anyone had the recipe for Gran's rolls, which no one did. I have not had them in at least 20 years, and Gran has since passed on. So I began scouring the internet looking for photos of rolls that looked like Gran's, which sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud. But I was looking for a specific texture that I remembered from my childhood. I actually created a chart with the rolls that looked the most like hers with those ingredients. And then I would get on my phone with my aunts and I would go through every single ingredient, workshopping this recipe. So my auntie Linda would say, well, no, Gran did not have brown sugar in her rolls. And then my Aunt Barbara would say, well, she used to rise them on the stovetop. And we would go back and forth and back and forth. I think this was about 2 weeks of workshopping, just what might the recipe look like. And I can remember it clear as day. It was a Friday night. I had planned on making the first batch of rolls that Saturday morning. It's about 11 p.m. I'm in bed. My cats, my husband, everyone is snuggled together. And I cannot stop thinking about these rolls. So I get out of bed. I go downstairs. And at 11:30 on a Friday night, I start making these rolls. That initial experience changed me. I didn't know what I was doing. I had never made rolls before from scratch. But I can remember feeling the flour in my hands, measuring, kneading the dough, checking the temperature on the milk, making sure that the yeast was alive. And I cried. I sobbed, actually. I don't exactly know what I was crying about in the moment. All I know is that I could feel generations of women before me, with me, in that kitchen, in that moment. My heartache of my infertility experience poured out of me as I kneaded the dough. I allowed myself to grieve in that moment when perhaps in my waking life I had been trying to be strong, trying to accept the situation, trying to be mature about it, quote unquote mature, but I was really sad. So I made my dough. I put it in the refrigerator to rise overnight. And I got up the next morning and made another batch. That day and many weekends to follow, my sister would do a drive-by and pick up a batch of rolls and then drop them off at her mom's house and her grandmother's house so that we could all taste test. And let me tell you, those first rolls were not it. It was not it at all. So I did more research and I watched YouTube videos. And what happened was I found myself talking about the rolls to everyone, anyone who would listen. And not only that, but everyone I would speak to would also start speaking to other people about these rolls. My sister would be at the hair salon and she would text me. My hairstylist says that her sister makes a roll and she laminates it like the Danish do. So then I would try that technique. That wasn't it. Another friend would say, well, my partner kneads the dough for at least 15 minutes. So then I would try that. Side note, that worked. Over the course of, let's say, 3 to 4 weeks, we came up with what we thought was as close to Gran's rolls as we could get, at least for now. But something else happened. One of the batches of rolls I brought to my cousin's house. She has 2 young kids. The kids loved the rolls. And about a month later, they came to visit me. And my cousin's daughter says, "Auntie, can you make the rolls again?" She called me auntie, like she always calls me auntie. And through a series of synchronistic events, I realized I had been referring to this child as my cousin because she's my cousin's daughter. But she always called me auntie. Now let me side myself real quick. In many bodies of culture, we refer to elders as aunties and uncles, whether there are aunties or uncles or not. My aunts who were helping me workshop this recipe are biologically my first cousins. It doesn't really matter to me. They're my aunties. They've always had that role in my life. But it's important to mark that, the role that we play in each other's lives, outside of the formality of who you might be technically to me or how we're blood related, right? My cousin's daughter, Bella, was showing me the deference that I show my older cousins by calling me auntie. She was asking me to be that person in her life. I think it's also important for me to mention that during the weeks that we were workshopping this recipe, I was having a lot of dreams. I dreamed about Gran. Actually, one of Gran's descendants showed me the recipe in a dream. I would dream about my grandmother. I had dreams about my childhood church. And in fact, in one of the dreams, the elder women of the church who were so kind to me as a child, in my dream, they were looking at me with those same loving eyes. It felt encouraging in the moment, but I have to be honest. When I heard Bella call me auntie, really heard her, it flooded my system that I have been nurtured so well and so lovingly by so many women who were not my mother. And as someone who will not be a birth mother, my niece Bella was showing me my role in her life and perhaps in the lives of other children, the other young people who I'm surrounded by. So when I talk about these roles, I'm not talking about just bread and butter. I'm talking about lineage and relationship. I'm talking about love. Everyone's experience with fertility is different. This is mine. I had to really accept in my heart that I can love and be loved by beautiful children who were not my children. And I felt a little bit of shame when I first realized that Bella had been calling me auntie the whole time, and I was almost rejecting that, almost afraid to fully embody this eldership that she was asking me for. So the name Recipes for Grief, again, we're not talking about just bread and butter. Me stepping into the role of elder in the relationships that I have with younger cousins and the children of my friends, even perhaps strangers, that has been my recipe for grief. It has been a salve to a broken heart. Accepting an eldership role has been filling to my empty womb. It brings me comfort alongside my sadness. And so, yes, we're going to talk about roles and cake and gumbo and TV dinners. We're going to talk about all of it. The taste of things, the texture of things, and we're also going to talk about the texture of our lives, how we are touched in our soul by our experiences, how loss changes us. It has certainly changed me. the loss of my fertility is just a sliver of my experience of loss. And in the coming episodes, I will certainly share about the other losses I've experienced in my life. My mother, my father, my grandmother, aunts and uncles, these people who raised me, all the women at church, many of them have already passed on. And yet, when I put my hand in dough, when I put my hand in soil, when I hug another being, human or non-human, I feel those connections. I feel those loved ones with me. It feels rather important to say that making these roles did not remove my grief. Not at all, actually. I would say even that I'm still grieving in a certain sense, but those early days, weeks, and months I would describe as acute grief. Even while making the roles, I would be crying as I kneaded the dough. I cried myself to sleep many a nights during that time. I found it really challenging to be present for other people, at work, for my loved ones. When I would commute to work, I would scream in my car. I would turn up the music really loud so no one could hear me and just let fucking loose. And there were other things I did to tend to my grief. My husband and I painted a small canvas together in lieu of a headstone to mark the ending of our fertility journey. And we had a funeral-like ceremony, if you want to call it that, just the two of us, where we spoke and played music and cried, lit candles, and said a formal goodbye to that experience and that path. A few months later, I started hosting an online grief vigil that I host once a month called Candle Hour. In summertime, I ordered 200 daffodils. I planted them in December, and they're actually blooming now in March as I record this. And in December, before my hysterectomy, I gathered 9 good friends of mine for a crone ceremony, and I had them initiate me into this new chapter that I'm embracing. Grief doesn't just go away. We metabolize it and we incorporate it into our identities. Creating this role recipe became a container for this grief. And it was a communication of what the future might hold. The roles helped me see possibilities where a week prior there were no possibilities. But eating the roles brought me joy. It's almost as if it made me feel like a kid again, surrounded by my family, perhaps a simpler time, even though my childhood wasn't actually simple. But eating the roles, sharing that experience with my aunts and my cousins and my sister and my friends, and that part brought me joy. But the actual making of the roles was a very griefful experience. It allowed me to be griefful because I'm in the kitchen by myself. My hands are active, so this is a somatic experience. Kneading dough for 15 minutes is really tiring. My mind would wander and I would think about how many people before me, how many generations have been kneading dough. In the weeks that we were workshopping the recipe, when my fertility journey ended, I was going into an already griefful time of year for me. I have a lot of death anniversaries in the beginning of November. And so I would have these feelings when I would be working with the dough, like how many death anniversaries are on one day? How many death anniversaries are on any given day? How many people died today? How many people's hopes have died today? Who else feels despair today? Even though I was experiencing something very personal, I could feel the collective through the process of making the roles, which makes sense because I would also have to share the rolls because I can't eat 24 rolls every day for a month. I mean, I can. But my focus of I'm not going to be a birth mother was expanded. My perspective changed through the process of making rolls, sharing the rolls, talking about the rolls. I could feel the community around me, both living and not living, or perhaps in spirit. Life is so much bigger, and grief is so much bigger than just my sadness or my tears. I really feel connected to everything when they say that there is no separation between us and God. I feel that when I talk about the rolls, when I think about the rolls, when I eat the rolls. I really love these rolls that we created, and they're not Grand's, they're ours. I actually call them milk line rolls. It's said that we have 3 lines of ancestry: our bloodline, who are the people we come from biologically, our storyline, the myths and legends that inspire us, and our milk line, those people who actually care for and nurture us. The creation of the milk line rolls helped me see all of the incredible people who nurtured me, who gave me their metaphorical milk. And this process, alongside the wisdom of my niece and future ancestor Bella, has helped me locate my place in the milk line lineage. After 6 months of thinking about starting this podcast, writing outlines, taking notes, researching and developing what recipes for grief could be, I started recording with telling my own story about the magical rolls that held me during my infertility grief. The first 4 inaugural interviews are complete, and now I'm in the final stages of getting this podcast ready to publish. One of my favorite quotes is from Octavia Butler's book, Parable of the Sower, where Butler reiterates repeatedly, everything you touch changes. Everything you change changes you. God is change. Even though it's my favorite quote, every time I remember it, I'm in awe at how deeply true it is. This podcast is at the beginning of hopefully what is a long and fulfilling journey. And I've already been changed. I'm already changed. Creating this podcast was far more griefful than I thought it would be, which again kind of sounds silly when I say it out loud because it is a podcast about grief and nourishment after all. Fears and doubts of not being good enough have come bubbling to the surface and are at an all-time boiling high. I alluded to my parents and my childhood, but I'm going to speak a little bit more on that right now. Growing up, my parents were disabled. My father died when I was 8. He was 48. And shortly thereafter, my mother's health declined to the point that she needed to move into a long-term convalescent home. She lived in convalescent homes until she died, maybe 12 or 13 years after my dad died. Because of their disabilities, there were a lot of things that my parent couldn't be there for me through. They physically were not able to support me. And this is where my family, my extended family, stepped in to care for me, to raise me, to feed me, to clothe me, to cheer me on. But survivor's guilt is hella real. Earlier this morning, I was telling my husband about my college graduation. You know, I'm in my little mini dress with my cap and gown, feeling fly. And after the graduation ceremony, my friends and I, my aunts, we all went to the convalescent home to celebrate with my mom. My mom had multiple sclerosis, and she would have good days and bad days. This is before there were any medications for multiple sclerosis. Getting that diagnosis in the 70s was basically a long descent to death. It's very, very different today. And so my mom would have good days and bad days. On good days, she would be alert and engaged in the conversation, even though she couldn't speak. And on bad days, she could barely hold her head up or keep her eyes open. My college graduation day and my grad school graduation day were not good days for her body. And I'm having that feeling again doing this podcast, where I go from this excitement and elatement. Is that a word? I go from this excitement and momentum to just feeling immense guilt for having any joy at all. Who am I to deserve anything good when the people who I love suffer? Oh, grief is a motherfucker, ain't it? So I'm just going to read this poem. I saw it on Instagram this morning. It was actually reposted by podcast guest Melanie Shekels. It was originally posted on the IG page, Poetry is Not a Luxury. Thank You by Ross Gay. If you find yourself half naked and barefoot in the frosty grass, hearing again the earth's great sonorous moan that says you are the air of the now and gone, that says all you love will return to dust and will meet you there. Do not raise your fist. Do not raise your small voice against it, and do not take cover. Instead, curl your toes into the grass. Watch the cloud ascending from your lips. Walk through the garden's dormant splendor. Say only, thank you, thank you. And so in my own way, creating this podcast is my thank you. It is my prayer to all that I know and love that will one day return to ash and meet me when I am in ash. I don't raise my voice against this truth, but instead because of it. I've been asking myself, how can I cultivate joy? How can I do something exciting or feel these butterflies inside of my belly when my nearest and dearest aren't here to enjoy it with me or may not have the same experience? And I think the better question is to ask, who am I not to? If I am alive, and that I am, who am I not to live my fullest expression of creativity, to live my fullest expression of the divine that flows through me? Who am I not to use my voice to lend itself to, hopefully, the healing journey that I think we all are on, ultimately bringing us to our liberation? Once again, I'm finding myself without a pretty bow to tie up this package. I could probably go on for hours sharing with you the miles I've walked in my mind in the creation of this podcast. But instead, I just offer you my prayer. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for lighting your candles. Thank you for being here and witnessing my story with an open heart and an open mind. I've actually written out the entire story on my website, AndreaSextonDumas.com. That's AndreaSextonDumas.com. If you'd like to share your recipe for grief, leave a 3-minute voicemail and your message may be played on a future podcast. The phone number is 510-426-6041. 510-426-6041. Find me on Instagram and TikTok at Recipes for Grief. And now, here's a little advice from my grandmother.
Life isn't easy. You just have to make the best of it.